has transformed software giant Wipro and is also transforming the Indian IT industry. Such a pleasure to have with us Mr. TK Kurien. Mr. Kurien, thanks so much for talking to us here on NDTV. Let me start by getting a sense of where the world economy stands in 2015. Is the pessimism of last year now giving way to some optimism?
Oh, absolutely. I think the US is certainly better than what it was last year. And more and more what we are finding is that people are opening up their purse strings, something that is kind of missing last year.
Right.
Europe, the good thing is that we see extreme cost pressures in Europe. Now with that, we think it's going to be positive for us as an industry. We see Europe clearly picking up this year because we're seeing more and more deals coming into the pipeline that we never saw a couple of years ago.
Okay.
As far as India is concerned, the good news is that we have a new government.
Right.
And the level of enthusiasm, if you may, in the industry is really fabulous to see.
Okay.
To that extent, we're seeing our India pipeline also really growing.
Okay.
The only dark spot that we see here is oil and gas prices.
Okay, I'm going to, not necessarily a dark spot for India. For India, it's a very, very bright spot. We are absolutely thrilled about the way oil prices have gone. But let's talk about each of these markets. Importantly, America, you talked about the recovery, and of course, the recovery has been much better than what most experts had expected. Is America in many ways back in the driver's seat when we talk about the global growth engine? Is that a feeling that one has that now, with the US recovery setting in, it's all back to America driving global growth?
You know, I've always maintained that one of the greatest things about the US is the innovation engine that exists out there.
Right.
So every time there's a recession, the US kind of innovates its way out of the recession. And that's the huge positive. And that's really driven by one basic factor. Mobility of labor is huge in the US. Mm-hmm. It's very easy for a person to change his job in the US and do something completely new.
Different, right.
And the person wouldn't even think twice about doing it. Many other economies of the world, including Europe, really suffer from immobility of labor. Mm-hmm. Now, the funny thing is that if people don't retrain themselves in an age when technology is changing so quickly, ultimately what happens is that at some point of time it catches up with you.
Right.
And I think that's exactly what Japan suffered.
Right.
And if Europe, I think, has an opportunity to change that. If government sees that opportunity, my own sense is they'll come out of this. If they don't, my own sense is they'll go the way of Japan.
Okay. Let's talk about Europe, because you mentioned Europe also, and you're saying that you're seeing some green shoots there in terms of your deals, in terms of the pipeline. But overall, Europe now, we're talking about possibly a stimulus. So on one hand, you've got the US Fed winding down the stimulus. You're talking about the Fed action and the impact it will have. On the other hand, we're saying, will the ECB go ahead and pump stimulus? So what's really happening? That's really confusing signals right now. Does Europe need a stimulus? And how worrisome is the fact that recovery hasn't set in on an expected pace in Europe?
So it's like this. If you have a small car with narrow wheels and you put a big engine onto it, chances are that if you really kind of put that car into hyperspeed, it'll collapse. So in many ways, the economy really has to kind of get its basics right. And if you look at the basics of every economy, it's all about employment.
Right.
It's all about creating employment and not necessarily holding employment through regulatory means. Employment has to create itself, and it has to create itself through opportunities which come from the capital market, and more importantly, opportunities that come up through the funds available in the capital markets, really funneling itself into innovation and
Sure.
new businesses. If that doesn't happen, fundamentally, the economy will not kind of restructure itself. And I think that's the challenge.
That's really been the challenge which we've got.
So stimulus works as long as there are fundamentals to support that stimulus.
Right.
If there are no fundamentals, the prognosis is bleak.
Right. Let's now talk about India, because you spoke about India again, and the fact that there's a lot of positive talk about India. Here in Davos also, many experts saying, you know what, India will be the star. Everybody wants to know what Prime Minister Modi is doing. Share with us the view on India. What is it that some of your customers are saying? What are the talks that are happening? Are the positive signals translating into real action on the ground, or are there concerns that are being expressed by customers or clients there?
So here's what's happening. If you look at really the one big change that's happened is there is hope today. Last year, at the same time, the hope was missing. When you have a population size the size of ours in India, if you don't have hope, then fundamentally what happens is you leave a generation behind. And I think all of us were at a stage where we really believed that we were going to leave a generation behind.
Right.
Every person in one generation really wants something better for the next generation.
Sure.
And if you start missing that,
Then
fundamentally
it's
what
a worry.
happens is it's a downward spiral from there. And I think that's what we were missing. Right now, the biggest thing that's going for us is hope. Now, there are lots of policy announcements which have been made. We are seeing investment interest on the ground. But in a democracy, don't expect to see sudden change.
Right.
The funny thing about democracies are that the stresses that build up in a normal authoritarian regime does not stay in a democracy.
Sure.
Democracies kind of let themselves out on a fairly frequent basis.
Right.
The stresses are kind of relieved very quickly. But when they do change, the change is really going to be there for a long time. So I'm very positive about what's happening in India. Now, it's not going to happen in the next 1 month. It's not going to happen in the next 6 months.
Right.
It's going to be slow, but it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think that's what all of us are looking forward to.
When we talk about India, we have to talk about China. And China's latest growth numbers show that growth. At the same time, you've got the IMF and the World Bank saying that India is all set to surpass China's growth rate. So it will become the largest, the fastest growing economy, large economy in the world. How significant is the fact that on one hand, you've got China slowing down. On the other hand, you've got India's economy gathering pace, gathering momentum and growth rates looking better for the next few years.
So, here's the funny thing about growth. Growth is like running a marathon. You can lead in the first mile, but you've got the rest of the marathon to kind of finish. So when we plan growth, it's not the growth spurts that all of us should get excited about. It is the steadiness of the growth and the sustainability of growth. And that's something that I believe a democracy is far better in managing
Right.
than a controlled environment like they have in China.
Sure.
So I'm more positive about what's going to happen in India than what I see in China. But again, remember that in one place what happens is that you have order,
Yeah.
and order by itself creates momentum.
Right.
A self-generated order and self-disciplined order is normally the best way to drive long-term growth.
Right.
And that's why I'm a little more positive about India than China.
Okay. It's good to know from you that you're more positive about India than about China. Now let's shift and talk about oil. That has perhaps been the single most dominant theme, the big global headline throughout 2015, perhaps will continue to be this year as well. You talked about how oil is playing havoc with certain economies, with companies, the oil and gas majors, many of them laying off in a big way, and that will have an impact on businesses around the world. Share with us how important this development is, because for countries like India, it's actually a boon.
It is. But remember this, that, we were used to a certain level in terms of oil prices. The oil prices have come down. It's clearly going to relieve the stresses in the economy. That's the positive. So ultimately what's going to happen is that disposable income there's going to be more disposable income in the hands of people.
Right.
On the other hand, governments are going to suffer because still now a lot of governments made money by taxing oil. Now they're going to tax something else to make sure the deficit is kind of managed.
Right.
So it's a plus in many ways for the consumer. It's a negative in many ways for governments that depended upon this as a source of income.
Right.
Now for us as an economy out of India, I think it's a huge positive. But remember this, that ultimately what happens is that any commodity cycle, it lasts for some time. When it comes back with a huge shock.
Yeah.
And you would find that in any commodity pricing, something that goes down very quickly normally tends to come up also pretty quickly.
And that's something we need to be prepared for, especially governments like India, which is why perhaps they've been following a mixed approach. So while they've passed on certain benefits to consumers by reducing petrol diesel prices, we've also seen the government absorbing some bit of the benefit with the excise duty. So it's been a balanced approach. But you think India has a lot to worry if we see that sharp upturn in oil prices, which ultimately will come?
I think that's the worry.
Right.
So we have, think about a economy that suddenly has got a lease of life.
Right.
There's a lot we can do with the time that we have gained.
Sure.
right? And that's what we need to kind of utilize and really utilize it effectively. Because once we are able to do that and we start getting the basics of the economy right, where real jobs get created, real disposable income happens,
Sure.
we move from services into core manufacturing, then that is sustainable growth. Otherwise, whatever we do is going to be short term.
Okay. Let's shift gears and now talk about the IT industry that you represent. Wipro particularly pleased with its latest quarterly numbers that have come better than expected. Share with us overall where the IT industry stands right now. What are some of the concerns areas and where are the bright spots?
I think the biggest positive is demand. We don't see a letdown in demand. Admittedly, what's going to happen is that IT expenditure in the back office functions are going to come down. But there are a whole bunch of contracts out there that have been negotiated at pretty high prices that are all going to come up for rebid. Mm-hmm. When that happens, we believe that most of the share in that game is going to be won by players like us and our competitors out of India. These are the guys who are going to win it. And a lot of the market share is going to be given up by the established players. We've seen that happening over the past couple of years. We're going to see more of that happening. That's the bright spark. The hard part is going to be this, that over a period of time, we're going to find more and more technology getting into the kind of work that we do. And it's going to disintermediate. And it's going to, large parts of the work that we do today are going to get automated out. Mm-hmm. Which fundamentally means that we're going to find skill sets that we were used to in the past. They have to move to a completely different level.
Right.
So in a way, we have to give up some parts of what we have done all these years and move to a completely different level in terms of skill sets and in terms of handling technology and in terms of our companies itself managing intellectual property.
Right.
So that is the shift that we have to manage.
Sure.
And normally what happens in the technology industry is this, and that's a funny thing about the tech industry. Every shift that happens, some companies make the shift, a lot of companies don't
actually, right.
And it really comes down to the cultural aspects of what you have within your company that you believe in and the speed at which you react to it that makes the impact. So for us, we are very conscious of it.
Are you reacting at that speed at which is desirable? Because many were watching very closely some of the moves that have been made, especially since you've come on board at the top of the guard. We've seen some important changes that have taken place, of course, most recently with the exit of Mr. Senapati as well. Share with us on a transformational basis, on an organizational level, how Wipro has changed over the last 2 years.
It's pretty simple. We have really moved back to what we believe are the core values that keep companies running in the long run. So for us, it's pretty clear. There are some values that will help you survive not just 1 year, not just a decade, but probably a century. Mm-hmm. And fundamentally, if you look at that, they're pretty simple values. The first one is the whole concept of speed.
Right.
The market rewards you, customers reward you for doing something quickly, mm-hmm. not for sitting and thinking about it and acting after everybody else has moved. So speed is a value that we really kind of value within the organization. The second one is energy. Mm-hmm. We believe that if you have leaders with energy, they're able to energize a whole bunch of people around them. And that comes back to, are you a leader that can lead people, or are you a leader who can who'll sit in the back and push people forward? There's a big difference between the two. We really like to go for the first.
Right.
The third is folks who can kind of collaborate. People who build walls around them typically don't succeed. Mm-hmm. It's people who reach out to each other and help each other along that succeed in the world of tomorrow. Because nobody can know everything. So that's another value that we really kind of look for within the company.
Okay. How does Wipro stack up right now when we talk about your peers? TCS, Infosys. I know you don't like to talk competition, but at least in broad terms, TCS has pipped Reliance as the most profitable company. You've also got Infosys that's undergoing a huge transformation, again, change of leadership there. What are some of the strengths that Wipro has vis-a-vis its peers right now?
I think it's just our people. It's as simple as that. The biggest thing about Wipro is that Wipro is a highly entrepreneurial culture. Wipro is not a command and control culture. And in entrepreneurial culture, what happens is that people do stuff on their own, and ultimately, over a period of time, the sum of parts is greater than the whole. And that's really what's kept Wipro growing all these years. I really don't worry about quarter to quarter results.
Right.
In fact, neither does my boss. What we really look for is how can we build a company that can last for the next 50 to 100 years, that can really stay out there and become a world leader.
Is Wipro here to last for the next 50 to 100 years? Because the big question, sorry to interrupt you, is that many believe that, IT industry, which was in many ways the sunrise industry, the best years of IT, those are gone. So, you really need to bring about those transformational changes for companies like Wipro to now last the 50 to 100 years that you're talking about.
So we started our life as a consumer products company. We made
Right.
vegetable oils.
Right.
Then we got into making hydraulics.
Right.
Then we got into making computers. Then we got into software.
And now what next?
Exactly.
Right.
So that is a transition that we have gone through.
Right.
And that's again deeply cultural.
But you haven't answered the what next question.
Well, that I don't answer that on television right now.
But there is a what next that is being planned for Wipro. That's
Absolutely.
okay.
In fact, for us, the biggest change that's going to happen is that we are going to create something completely new.
Okay.
And
Diversified out of IT?
not out of IT. We believe that information technology is going to spread itself everywhere. It's going to have its tentacles in everything that we do. How we maximize that is where value is going to get created.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that we are working on.
Okay. I have to talk to you also about Rishad's role in Wipro. He seems to be obviously taking up a more and more important role in the company. Share with us what the company's vision is with regard to Rishad's role and the role that he's likely to play in the future in the company.
So Rishad's role is going to be ultimately decided by the board of directors.
Right.
Mr. Premji continues to be a large shareholder, and Rishad's role is going to be really decided by the board. Today, I think he's a valued employee. He's contributing significantly in the areas that he's playing in. Nothing more than that. So, there's been a lot of speculation about Rishad's role in the future. I think a lot of that is just talk.
Okay. Are you ruling it all out? All the reports that have come out?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I think the biggest thing is that today Rishad is a valuable player, and he continues to be a valuable player, and he will continue to be a valuable player. And he's part of the team. So being part of the team has got responsibilities, which is that each of us, starting with me, Rishad, and everyone else is part of the team, have to help each other out there to succeed. And that's really what he's all about.
But also responsibilities as a shareholder, because that also puts him in a very unique position there, an employee and of course the largest shareholder.
I think the responsibility of the shareholder is not taken by Rishad. It's taken by Mr. Premji.
Right.
And that's it. And Mr. Premji is not going anywhere.
Right, of course, no. By the largest shareholder, of course, I meant the heir in many ways to Wipro.
What Mr. Premji does and who he declares his heir is something very personal for him.
Right.
Right. That's got
And of
nothing
course,
to do
his
with
philanthropic initiatives have made headlines around the world. Mr. Kurien, I have to also talk to you about layoffs in the IT industry that have again been making headlines for all the wrong reasons with your peers and of course, overall in the IT industry. How real is the scare with regard to layoffs?
I think here's what it is. And, I think much more was made of it than necessary. The reality is that in every organization, you have performers and you have people who don't perform. Like, for example, when you have a cricket team, if you drop a bowler who's not performed, nobody will even bother about it. In fact, the crowd would probably bay for the blood of that bowler who still continues to be as part of the team, in spite of the fact the person's not performing. So dropping people out of teams is absolutely normal for every enterprise.
But is it happening more now than it did earlier is the question, because have market realities changed in a way that layoffs have become a reality more now than earlier?
I don't think so. I think there's a reskilling of the work pool that's going to happen. That's going to continue to happen. Some people will reskill themselves, some won't.
And they'll lose out.
And they will lose out. That's the whole law of nature. That's how people progress. People don't progress by standing in one place. That creates a sense of anarchy. And I think that is absolutely real, always has been real. And I think just too much of noise has been made about this.
All right, too much noise and not too much reality is how Mr. Kurien is putting it. But I'd like to also talk to you specifically about the meeting that the IT industry had with the finance minister. It's obviously a very proactive government that's listening in to what the industry has to say. The IT industry has had its set of demands, a wish list there. Is there sense and a hope and optimism there that some of the demands of the IT industry will be met? The forthcoming budget perhaps address some of the concerns?
Look, the finance minister is walking on thin ice. He's got a lot of he's got a fiscal deficit that he has to manage. Ultimately, what he does with the IT industry, I think is going to be relevant in the context of what he does for the economy on the whole. The economy on the whole is going to be what is going to be interesting. What he does for the IT industry, in my view, we can take a shock for a year.
Okay.
It doesn't really matter.
Okay. But from the economic standpoint, from the overall economy, do you expect this budget to be a big, bold one? Do you think it will be a game changer in many ways for the Indian economy?
Absolutely. But again, going back to the first point that I made, it really depends upon the degrees of freedom that the finance minister has. And if he's able to use the degrees of freedom effectively to really get growth back into the economy on a sustainable basis, that'll create value for all of us. It's not what it does for a particular industry. You know, what it does for industry is just short term.
Right.
And ultimately, if the industry can't pick itself up and be competitive globally, fundamentally the industry should not stay.
Okay, so you're saying that the onus lies as much on corporate India, as much on the industry as it does with the government, because it's all very easy to criticize, complain, talk about policy changes, but the industry needs to do its bit.
Yeah, the last thing India needs today is a bunch of whiners. I think we've got plenty.
We have plenty of them, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Let's not talk about whining and let's talk about positives. And the one big positive for the Indian economy is going to be President Obama's forthcoming visit. It's being watched very closely. The IT industry is a very, very important stakeholder. And of course, some of the important concerns of the IT industry likely to feature in President Obama's visit. Share with us, one, the significance of the visit overall and for the IT industry in particular.
I think number one, it's very positive for India itself, because I think there is an admission now by countries across the world that India is important. Very different from where it was about a year ago. But don't expect one big visit to change stuff on the ground.
Right.
I think on the ground, what happens in a democracy, like I said earlier, it's slow.
Right.
Right. It's not just one President Obama who kind of can decide everything.
Right.
He can certainly help. He can point in the right direction. But there's a whole legislative mechanism that sits in the US that's got to kind of fall in line.
Sure.
And as we've seen over the years, that isn't very easy.
Right.
So while I think it's positive because it gives the country a buzz, it gives the country recognition, it gives the country markets, reality is that it's not going to change anything dramatically on the ground overnight.
But in terms of the Indo-US relationship, do we see that on a new high with the two leaders, with Prime Minister Modi and President Obama? Just look at the number of visits, number of meetings they've had, the number of times they've interacted in the last 6 months or so, and the fact that he's actually visiting India on Republic Day. You've got a second visit coming from the president. So these are important factors. Do you feel the Indo-US relationship is on a new high right now?
So here's where it is again. Communication is the first step towards building a relationship. And I think right now what we have is plenty of communication. Relationship will follow this. But again, when two countries decide to kind of get closer to each other, it's not something that happens overnight.
Right.
Especially in a democracy. There are pulls and pressures of democracy. We have to sustain it. If one government communicates, the next government does not, then what happens is that it's never going to lead to trust.
Sure.
So to that extent, I see this as a big positive, but not something that I think is going to be a watershed event.
Okay, it's not going to be a watershed event. It's important that you say that because that's a sense of realism from the kind of hype and euphoria that you usually see around events like these. But I'd like to get a specific wish list from the IT industry when this meeting really happens. You're going to see top CEOs that are also going to be holding meetings. From the IT industry's point of view, given the presence that you have in the US, given the importance of the IT industry in the Indo-US relationship, what are some of the things that you think should be addressed at this forum?
I think here's what it is. I think the biggest thing that we'd like to see is free trade. Mm-hmm. What happened was that sitting in India, many countries across the world told us how it's important for us to open up markets
Right.
when we were not really competitive.
Sure.
One fine day when we became competitive and we asked for the same thing in return,
We didn't get it in return.
we didn't get it in return.
Right.
I think free trade has got huge benefits for every economy across the world. And I think if governments, both on the Indian side as well as on the US side, can recognize that free trade is important for whatever is the competitive advantage of each country, then overall as economies, we maximize each other. And I think that's the recognition that needs to come in.
So right now, it's not a relationship on an equal footing. Is that a correct assessment?
It's a relationship which is on equal footing. I don't think it's wrong to say it's not a relationship on equal footing. It is a relationship on equal footing. I think there needs to be a little more understanding.
Okay. Okay. I'm reading a lot into what you're saying, a lot more understanding, but I'm going to end it here. We're running out of time, Mr. Kurien. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Here's wishing you all the best with Wipro, with all the transformational changes that you're bringing about in future. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
With camera person Arif Radu, this is Shweta Rajpal Kohli reporting from Davos for NDTV.